So we're all pretty fucking sick of Star Wars, aren't we? Ever since my first exposure to The Phantom Menace when I was 4 or 5 years old, I have had Star Wars occupy a massive part of my personality. From the cheaper little plastic lightsabers that I used to beat the crap out of my brother with, to costuming and, as an adult, full-blown Mandalorian cosplay. Star Wars has had a massive impact on my life. So when little Josh back in 2012 heard that Disney was acquiring Lucasfilm, I was excited to see what the success of the MCU would do for Star Wars. Disney's stab at the Star Wars universe so far has been pretty mixed, with some serious highs and lows. The Force Awakens is right in the middle, with something that was boring, safe, but fun enough to watch. Then Rogue One came out, and it was so refreshing to see Star Wars from a different perspective. Not only were we away from the space opera bullshit of the Skywalkers, it was a gritty, grounded experience that was actually pretty compelling. And then that was followed up by The Last Jedi.
I don't know how you make a movie as bad as The Last Jedi.
Oh, well, that sucks.
The worst Star Wars movie ever created.
Rian Johnson violated you and murdered your childhood.
Star Wars had a bit of a downhill turn from there. Solo was very poorly received, despite being a perfectly fun heist movie, and The Rise of Skywalker is a movie that exists, and I don't think we need to say anything more about that.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
That left Star Wars in a pretty sour spot, right around the time that Disney Plus launched, and we got The Mandalorian, another refreshing take on the Star Wars universe that wasn't more Skywalker shenanigans, until Season 2 came around, turned it into cameos and fan service central, and that's basically all we've had since. The Book of Boba Fett and Kenobi left me so jaded, cynical, that I gave up on Star Wars. So when Andor came around with glowing reviews, I didn't give it the time of day.
So what made me change my mind? Why did I start giving a shit? Why did I watch through the entirety of Andor in a single sitting? Well, I watched this video essay by Beghast talking about how Disney has infantilized Star Wars, how they've made it super simple and babyfied.
These movies did not make me feel like a kid. They made me feel like a child.
And that inspired me to give Star Wars another shot, because Andor stands against everything that Disney has done with its media over the past decade. And I'm glad I did. But Andor's brilliance comes with a problem, and that's that it makes everything else Star Wars look like shit by comparison.
Disney makes media designed for people with TikTok brain rot so bad that they would wear an Apple Vision Pro all day just to have Subway Surfers in their peripheral vision at all times, like an intravenous drip, to make sure that they don't have a single fucking thought the entire day. And they're doing it well. In Disney's quest to dominate the media landscape, they've effectively tried to make media for everyone. On paper, that's not a bad thing, except in trying to create media for everyone, you make media for no one. All the themes and ideas and plots and characters are designed intentionally as one-dimensionally as possible to make sure that the widest possible audience can sit down, watch this movie, and understand what's going on. But in doing this, the media doesn't mean anything. It is just bright flashing lights to keep you entertained for a little while. Disney sandblasts projects into smooth, textureless pieces of content that anyone can just consume without having to switch on a single brain cell. Regardless of if it's Star Wars or Marvel or any other IP that Bob Iger decides to eat up like a real-life game of media agario. It's had a real impact on how consumers consume media and content, and I want to clarify that that is an important distinction. To me, shows like She-Hulk or Kenobi are examples of content. Market research scripts that are designed for the lowest common denominator, the people that'll eat up anything that Daddy Iger blesses their content-hungry eye holes with, as long as it has their preferred little label on it. I'd really boil down the distinction to really one question. Did it make you feel something? Not just mild amusement or distracting you from the not so nice thoughts up here. Did you watch it and it made your heart do that thing? It made your chest fill with a feeling. Did it do that?
So what was it about Andor that actually made me feel something? Well, it felt mature, not in the juvenile sense of mature when you think of drugs and violence. No, it's mature in the way that I think of mature adults. Someone that is confident in their place in the world and what they're doing. But to really understand what makes Andor so great, we also need to dig in to what has been failing in Star Wars over the last little while. And thankfully, Disney's given us plenty of failures to look at. One of my biggest complaints about Disney media is that they are criminally lacking in subtext. What you see is more or less what you get. And the Disney Star Wars movies are one of the best examples of how bad that gets.
Through the ages, I've seen evil take many forms. The Sith, the Empire. Today, it is the First Order. Their shadows spreading across the galaxy. We must face them. All of us.
Characters just dump exposition at each other constantly to make sure that the audience never gets lost for a single second, instead of letting them have natural human conversations that make them feel like actual people. While a lot of people rightfully critique the prequels for a lot of things, that trilogy actually knows how to use subtext to get the audience more engaged. Not just with the mystery that comes with ambiguity, but also so they don't feel like they're a grown adult being spoon-fed a story so basic that you could recreate that one scene from Fight Club.
What is this? This is a chemical burst.
The Darth Plagueis scene in Revenge of the Sith is a great example of subtext being used to further the depth of a scene. While Palpatine monologues to Anakin about the powers of the dark side that could potentially save Padme, his intentions are not being explicitly stated, like he's telling the viewer, yes, I want to make him evil. But as the audience, we can pick that up based on the context clues that we've been given in the rest of the movie. In contrast, the Disney movies are really bad about characters just spewing out what they're feeling and what their intentions are, like they're making a journal entry or like it's a fucking episode of Caillou.
You can't skate.
This is the sort of thing that Beghast is talking about when he accuses Disney of infantilizing Star Wars. The movies are made in a way that you don't even need to rub two brain cells together to understand what's going on. And speaking of no brain cells, that's how most of the characters act in the Disney Star Wars movies. Typical screenwriting advice would tell you to put your characters in a situation and have those characters make decisions to further the plot. These decisions would be inspired by the character's background, their history with the other person in the room, their internal desires and motives, and also the image that they're trying to present to the other person in the conflict. All these elements would create realistic human decisions that would move the plot forward in a way that makes pretty logical sense to anyone watching. The Disney trilogy does none of this. Instead of characters actually having motives and taking actions, we get a never-ending chain of plot conveniences that push the story forward in ways that don't really make sense. A lot of the time, just because the characters are in the right place at the right time. Rarely do characters in these movies ever make decisions that logically move the plot forward or distinguish them from the rest of the cast. In the original trilogy, Han doesn't join the rebellion because he's a hero like Luke or Leia. Han joins it because he wants the money and he wants the girl. He still does it, but understanding that those are his motivations makes him a distinguished, unique character among the roster. In the Disney trilogy, everyone's the hero type, cut with the same cookie cutter, which makes them all as uninteresting as the rest. Finn had so much potential to be an exception. A stormtrooper turned rebel, he had reason to have internal conflict and act differently from the rest of the cast, but that potential is never used. On a greater thematic level, Disney just sucks at saying anything of value. Now, I'm not saying the original trilogy or the prequels are, perfect art house cinema that has a deep, unique perspective on the human psyche, but the Disney trilogy says nothing, zero, nada. The original trilogy draws parallels to the American involvement in the Vietnam War. The rebels as the underdog Viet Cong, stripped of resources, but infinitely more resourceful than the bureaucratic war machine that is the Empire. A pretty direct metaphor for democratic imperialism and how the United States kind of meddles in everyone's international affairs. A good metaphor that continues to be relevant today. The prequels are an examination into how greed and corruption can eat away at democracy until all that's left is fascism.
So this is how liberty dies.
with thunderous applause.
They're not perfect metaphors. They're not the greatest examinations of these themes, but at least they try. That's not the line. In contrast, the first two movies of the Disney trilogy try to establish the idea that your heritage doesn't determine your destiny, which is a really interesting contrast to the first two trilogies. Then The Rise of Skywalker comes around, and we have Rey be Palpatine's daughter and take up the Skywalker name, which kind of thematically just throws everything out the window. There's zero thematic through line with the Disney trilogy, and now we're pretty familiar with the fact that there was also zero planning, which makes a lot of sense. While The Last Jedi does try to say something about the capitalistic profiteering out of war, it's such a small plot point in the movie that I can't say it counts. The Disney trilogy has gone from child-friendly to made for children. The themes and characters are built intentionally in a one-dimensional manner to reach as wide an audience as possible, but in the process makes it so that the story is so diluted that it doesn't mean anything. It's just images on a screen.
But Andor says something. Andor says a lot, actually. Andor doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't dump minute after minute of exposition at you. It doesn't try to feed you a story so basic that a 5th grader would cry if they handed it into their English teacher. Andor is mature, and it treats the viewer like they're mature too. Maybe I'm overhyping it because the bar has been buried 6 feet under. Or maybe Andor is an indication that Star Wars is back. Anyway, I'm gonna get to the point. What actually makes Andor so fucking good? Much like the first season of The Mandalorian, Andor doesn't rely on the viewer having an extensive knowledge of the greater Star Wars universe. You could take your laptop to your grandfather's gravestone, plonk down next to him, and he could watch along just fine with no questions, because it's not about all the space fantasy magic wizard bullshit. I actually recommended it to my parents.
I fall asleep in front of the TV quite often nowadays, but thanks for the tip. We started a couple of shows on Netflix yesterday and they were crap.
Because it's not a show made for just Star Wars fans. And I can't say that about Kenobi or Ahsoka. That's not to say that Andor is completely free of references to the rest of the galaxy far, far away. But cameos like Saw Gerrera or mentions of planets like Jakku aren't hitting you in the face with the Marvel reference frying pan that a lot of other Star Wars media does. All of these things are given a natural place in the story that doesn't break you out of your immersion. On the note of giving things a natural place in the story, Andor is really good at integrating lots of very varied stories in a really natural way. Most of the plot threads are established in such a way that it doesn't feel like Disney holding up the seed, being like,
Hey, look at the seed. I know you have no object permanence, but I'm gonna plant this, and you're gonna need to remember that later, okay?
It feels great to be able to connect the dots as little tidbits of information are fed to you over the course of multiple episodes. And you get that moment where you're like, oh, fuck. I know where this is going. And I can't say I had the same experience with Kenobi or The Mandalorian. And the plot threads aren't thrown at our heroes like teenagers egging a house. Every step forward feels intentional. Instead of the plot just magically moving forward because the characters were in the right place at the right time. Cassian and many other people's actions all have very real consequences that impact the story in ways that actually matter and make sense. These sort of things make me feel like the show is respecting me as an adult that actually has the capability to form at least a single critical thought, which, to be fair, is not a character trait I associate with Star Wars fans. Another element of Andor's maturity is the fact that characters don't just use dialogue to dump exposition over and over, like they're journaling out their feelings for the audience to understand. The writers don't try to fill in every single little gap because they look at you and say, this viewer is paying enough attention that they can do the math and piece together little bits of subtext, be that body language, context from earlier conversations, little bits that we know, what we would call dramatic irony. And it's kind of crazy to be praising Andor for this because it's like rule number 1 of cinema: show, don't tell. But while we're talking about showing, I don't think there's a single moment in Andor that is there just to show off spectacle, to have some big bombastic moment for the fun of it. Even comical moments, like Cassian and the security droid on the beach, are used to further the story, to show the Empire's excessive use of force to neuter civilians and maintain order in the galaxy, even on planets like Niamos that seem to be pretty much entirely just a holiday village. And while we're talking about locations, I love that Ferrix isn't just another deserty wasteland like we've seen with Jakku or the one in The Mandalorian that I don't remember the name of because it's not distinct. I'm looking up what the one in The Mandalorian is. Planets like Jakku and Navarro are just reskins of Tatooine. Neither of them are distinct enough to separate them from the original Tatooine that we were already familiar with. Ferrix isn't like that. It has distinctive architecture and cultural traits that make it feel like its own place and not just another reskin of Tatooine. It feels foreign enough to be new, but not so foreign that it feels out of place for Star Wars. The way that Bix and Marva and Brasso carry themselves and talk and interact with the world around them makes it feel distinct from Tatooine. That makes Ferrix feel important and memorable. And I love that Andor has so much grit compared to not only the mainline Star Wars movies, but also even a lot of the Star Wars series and what we've seen in The Acolyte so far. It doesn't feel clean and safe and like it's a studio lot that's just had some sand dusted over it. It feels like a real place. Everything feels lived in. It's something that the Netflix version of The Lost Airbender really struggles with, where a lot of environments don't feel like they're real environments. They feel like they're sets. That part of the realism of Andor brings it down to earth. It makes it feel like you can be on the streets of Ferrix with Cassian. Long story short, I really hope that Disney has the sense to greenlight more productions like Andor. Things that creatives clearly poured a ton of love and passion into and created something that actually makes us feel and think. I really want to see more projects that aren't just bargain bin scraps being fed to the consumers that'll eat anything. Until that starts happening, I'll be patiently waiting and watching other stuff and not giving Disney any of my money. Or I can go rewatch Andor again. Hey, thank you for watching all the way to the end. It's very much appreciated, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it that much. If you want to see a little bit more, you can hop over to the second channel where there's a video with me rambling some extra thoughts that didn't make it into the final video. And if you want even more than that with some behind the scenes and project breakdown stuff, there's my Patreon down below so you can pick my brain on my creative process. But next video is also a Star Wars thing. I will see you then.